Yeah, welcome to another edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. The Legendina, as ever, is in Rio. I'm over here in the UK. And Legendina, as you can see, I'm still wearing the Arctic jumper that I probably had on for the last 3 months or so. How's the weather doing where you are?
Very, very disappointing, quite
Really?
frankly. Yeah, lots of
Yeah.
rain, and it's down at around 20 degrees, which makes me feel cheated.
Yeah, our guest is laughing all over the place, grinning from ear to ear because he knows that you're taking the fucking piss. Now stop it. Stop it. As ever on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, we take a look, a backward look at a football match from some time in the annals of footballing history and try and make sense of it in a modern context and looking at the musical soundtrack and everything else. And Ben Jackson, the author of the Africa Cup of Nations, the history of an underappreciated tournament, and also host of the Belgian Football Podcast, is with us. Flipping out, what a time to be talking about the Africa Cup of Nations in arguably the best that I remember of this tournament ever. But who knows? You know more about the history than we do, Ben. Where do you rate it? How do you rate it?
Oh yeah, this one is right up there for sure. I mean, I think not had many nil-nils until last night when we had a couple at the end there, but the shocks and stuff have just been absolutely ridiculous. Like seeing some of these teams just beating the big boys not turning up, and then people getting sacked midway through the tournament before they've even qualified. They still then qualify for the next round, which has
Yes.
happened before. It has happened before. It's not the first time, but no, I've really, really enjoyed it. And I think it's been nice to see that it's really kind of captivating an audience this time. I think lots of people are watching and lots of people are enjoying the quality of the football and kind of the passion of the players and the kind of absolute ridiculous storylines. And I don't know about you guys, but there's been a couple of games that have been like, oh, do I want to watch that one? It's probably not going to be very good. And it ends up being an absolute classic. So hopefully it will keep going into the knockout rounds. We'll keep getting another couple of shocks and stuff along the way.
I have two questions in one. Firstly, how did you start getting interested in this competition? And secondly, why do you want to take us back to the previous time that the competition was held in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, delete as applicable?
Yeah, I think I went for Cote d'Ivoire in the book, and then I spoke to someone from Cote d'Ivoire, and he was very happy about it. So I was like, right, I'm just going to stick with what he's happy with. Yeah, for me, I guess kind of my interest in African football started around about 2011. I went off to Sierra Leone with a couple of friends to do some football coaching. Well, I think, as I say in the book, the kids were better than us at football anyway. They completely schooled us on a couple of occasions. And after that, I just absolutely fell in love with Sierra Leone as a country, fell in love with like kind of the people's passion for the game and stuff like that. Came back, started watching some of the tournaments. I'd kind of known about it a little bit, but kind of when I was a lot younger growing up, it was Egypt were winning all those tournaments that they did in the 2000s. So in my mind, it was like AFCON and Egypt were two together. Um, and then since then, it's kind of been everyone's been winning it at all different years. It's been really, really exciting. This final in particular, I think, yeah, because it is kind of the last time it was in the Cote d'Ivoire, first time Cameroon won it as well. Quite interesting storylines that came out of it. Some really good goals in the final as well. Quite entertaining. And there was one game I was watching the other day in the tournament that just I felt like I was rewatching a game from this era, this tournament as well. It just the stadium was so similar, the that quality of the pitch was so similar, the style of play was quite similar as well. I was just like, I feel like I'm watching what I've just been researching and stuff. But yeah, when you guys got in touch and asked about one of the finals, I thought this one just makes total sense. Just in terms of going back to Cote d'Ivoire.
So just to clarify, this is March of 1984 in Costa de Marfim. That's my compromise solution. I'm going to say it in Portuguese. Against between Cameroon and Nigeria. That's the game that you've chosen for us to have a look at.
Unfortunately, it had the wrong outcome. Let's just leave it at that for now. I'm not going to give away the ending, but perhaps you should start before 1984, though. You mentioned Egypt there, which was one of the founding members of the Cup of Nations, along with Ethiopia and Sudan. How did they come together, and when did they decide to get together, and how did it start off? How did it kick off?
Yeah, so it starts in the 50s. So Egypt, obviously by that time, Egypt are kind of a well-established sort of footballing nation. They've
They're
played at the
playing the Olympics in the
Olympics.
20s, aren't they?
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
they
like
go way
they've
back.
been. Yeah, and you think of the big clubs in Egyptian football, like they've been around at that time, like your Zamalek, your Al Ahly's, like these massive, massive clubs. Um, and they kind of are trying to push for African representation in FIFA because it's just you've still got this kind of colonial era mindset that oh, Africans can't do things by themselves. They can't play football. They can't organize a football like confederation or anything like that. They get together with Sudan and Ethiopia, and the only reason it's so small is again because so many of these teams are still under colonial occupation. Like the countries are under colonial occupation, so they're not independent states at the time. South Africa were also there at the beginning, but when they get together, so they get together in Lisbon to decide after FIFA have said you can be represented, be represented, you can get involved in football now. We'll let you in. They go to one of the meetings in Lisbon and they decide we're going to host ourselves a tournament. Um, South Africa in the draw. They have these four teams. They're all going to get together. Eventually, after a couple of kind of deciding on where to go, they end up in Sudan, in Khartoum. But South Africa then say, we're only going to send an all-white team, an all-black team. We're not going to send a mixed team. So the other three nations are like, well, you can't play then. They just tell them straight up, you're not here. And that's it for South Africa until the 90s. They do not return. Yeah, then these three teams get together and just play out this tournament in Khartoum, just the three of them. Egypt obviously win because at that point they are clearly the best team on the continent until they invite Ghana into the 60s. And then you start to get the snowballing effect of as countries kind of move out of the colonial era and become independent, they start to join up and become part of it. But then, to be fair to Egypt, they've obviously been able to maintain success over this whole time, where Sudan and Ethiopia just completely dropped off. I think many listeners probably have never really thought of those two nations as footballing nations, which is a massive shame because some of the players that were around during those early years were really good players for those two nations, but they've never really been able to capitalize on that early kind of footballing history that they have.
To be fair, though, both those countries have been engaged or were engaged in long civil wars from the 1950s. Obviously, Ethiopia in Eritrea, and not to talk of the sort of natural disasters that befell Ethiopia as well. There are other priorities, but also, change of regimes, going from Haile Selassie to military governments, etc. Football perhaps didn't have its rightful place. In Sudan, we know how difficult things have been in Sudan over the last 30, 40 years. But I'm intrigued that Ghana, when they came in, and I think you point out in your book many times that a conversation about the Africa Cup of Nations is not complete without a conversation about the politics around it as well. And as you're making the historical trajectory through the history of the Africa Cup of Nations, it struck me that of all the nations, Ghana was very, very fortunate to have post-colonialism as its first leader, Kwame Nkrumah. In terms of football, he liked a game, didn't he?
Oh, he loved it. He absolutely loved it. Yeah, like there's stories from the players where they basically could go to him. They had like a direct line, direct access to him if they wanted things done and stuff like that. It's yeah, I mean, it was quite a story. But yeah, I think because as well, like for the independence celebrations, he invites Stanley Matthews over to play for Accra Hearts of Oaks as well. So he's kind of for me, he had always this kind of idea that we now see a lot of the Middle Eastern countries do with their kind of like sports washing. But for him, it was very much this is a great way of kind of showing the world what we can do ourselves and how good we are. And he even like basically builds his own team as well, who then play against teams like Real Madrid and stuff like that. So he did absolutely love the game. Was very much there to watch the matches when they won as well. Like he was obviously pretty happy about that. And it kind of you see like Mobutu later on, and is a bit like I need to kind of get one, kind of do the same sort of thing. But he does it very much in his own style as well, in kind of the Mobutu way.
But the big question that this leaves me is, and this is something I've never understood. Looking forward to learning this one. Is that after the disaster of Mobutu's then Zaire in 74, the first sub-Saharan African team to do fantastically well in a World Cup is this Cameroon side. in 82. No, and it's this Cameroon side that then goes on to play in the final against Nigeria. So why is it Cameroon and not Nigeria because of its size, or Ghana because of its of the political input? Why Cameroon?
Yeah, I think they just were able to put together such a good team. Like I think the players that you see come through were just really well kind of suited in their prime. And also I think the problem that it still kind of exists a little bit today, less so than it did back then, was that a lot of these, like qualifying for the World Cup, was just ridiculously hard for African nations. And it still is. I still think it's quite a difficult one to get through. But obviously in 66, none of the African nations even turn up. And you wonder, maybe at some point, could the Ghana team of the 60s have gone to that World Cup? Like, how would they have fared in that? And then, so it is an interesting one because 74, yeah, it is an absolute disaster for them. But there's so much of this like political stuff going on in the background that just makes it an absolute disaster. And it's such a shame that that generation of players are always kind of considered in that light. And for lots of us, we see them as like, oh, the 74 team that didn't know how to play football. They didn't know the rules.
They could play the 74 team. What they couldn't do was defend against crosses, which is where Yugoslavia did them, But they held their own against Scotland for a while, and they could play against. You could see that they were technically quite good players. But this is the disaster of the Stanley Rouse FIFA, isn't it? You exclude Africa, and they look like a team that never come up against decent crosses because they were out of the loop.
Yeah, exactly. They never really get the chance to kind of get this World Cup experience that these other nations seem to get. And a lot of the teams they play against, like when you watch some of the old footage, again, it's not really goals coming from crosses. There's a lot of like fine, intricate playing around the box and stuff like that. And the technical ability of some of these guys is just amazing. And it's really interesting because then you get a lot of the time these guys are kind of even now called kind of like the pace and power players, aren't they? Like, oh, he's got pace, he's got power, but they never talk about the technical ability of these guys. And like this final as well is full of it.
This Cameroon side and the interplay on the edge of the area, it's wonderful to watch. It's technically it's very. There's lots and lots of space on the field, isn't there? There is lots and lots of space on the field. So, physically you wonder, and also maybe the coaching. But there's some lovely little passing moves going on.
Yeah. Oh, some of the goals. I think this final, especially some of the goals in this one, are just some of the best goals in terms of kind of like moving the ball and doing that sort of stuff that when I watched back some of the games, that it were just fantastic. And it's those players that we all kind of know about from this Cameroon side that are always involved in every kind of good bit of play that happens. Like obviously everyone knows about Roger Miller, even though he was again, good. Even in this final. In this final, he's already in his 30s. Yeah. Like he's just his career is just so ridiculous because it's at the end that everyone gets this recognition. But throughout the 80s, he's just this phenomenal player that is just such a joy to watch. And for me, obviously, he's before my time. But going back, I'd heard of him from that 90 World Cup. But then to go back and see him during the 80s and watch him play, it's just such a joy.
Yeah, he makes he's responsible for the best assist in the game, I think. Although let's not forget that the Nigeria goal was brilliant, but we'll come back to that very soon, and we'll come back to
all we are saying is come back to the Nigeria goal.
Yeah, well, and also all we are saying from Nigeria probably still today is, was it a fix? But let's leave that to one side. We will come to that. You can't enjoy this podcast without us getting to that point. We're very sore losers in Nigeria. That's just the way we are. But when Tim asked about why Cameroon, because the other point that you make in your book is that African football there is a political context, but also a colonial context. And I wonder how much of Cameroon's success and the Ivory Coast and actually, Algeria, Morocco, etc., is down to the French colonialism, because French colonialism had a different context or point of view, maybe is a better way to. You're a historian, aren't you? You'll know a better way of describing this. But I do know, particularly from my French African friends, that the way the colonialism worked from Paris was very different from the way it worked from Westminster. For example, as far as they were concerned, all these colonies were départements of France, whereas we wanted to make it clear, no, we are Britain, they are the rest of the world, and we rule the waves.
Yeah, no, it's just they were a lot more involved, and then it was like you said, it is that kind of like they'd even have representatives within the French Parliament for these countries and stuff like that. It was completely different sort of clear aspect. And I remember during kind of when I was studying African politics, and there was that moment where Guinea decide that they don't want to be part of this kind of French system anymore. And the kind of outrage from France, like, how could you possibly want to leave? Like, this is an incredible thing. We're all part of this one thing together. And then they were like, right, okay, well, we're not going to give you any money. We're not going to give you any of this. We're just going to leave you on your own and hope you aren't able to survive. But obviously, with the Cold War, they very much had a willing kind of recipients in the Soviet Union were more than happy to come and help them out. But I think you do see that, and I think we see it a lot now, don't we, where those nations are now able to kind of tap into the diaspora that is within France to get some talent into their teams. At the time for Cameroon, most of their players were still playing domestically. And that's another thing I really enjoyed about going back and looking through the history was seeing all these players still playing domestic football at that time and playing in the tournament. You'd have like one or two that had kind of gone off to Europe, like Miller and a couple of others within the Cameroonian side. But it was very much like a lot of them played for Cadence, Union Douala, like all these sort of like domestic sides. But I think you're right. I think the French kind of way of colonialism was so different to ours. Like as a British person, like yeah, like we were very much kind of hands off, like indirect rule sort of thing. Like we'll pick the kind of people we can trust to rule you, and we'll kind of kind of take advantage of them and use them as a way of doing it. With France, like no, we're just gonna you're now part of France, whether for like good or for bad for these countries at the end of the day is up for them to decide. But it is really interesting that the different dynamics between the two. And then to be fair with Cameroon as well, you did still have an English speaking kind of minority that were in there. And a couple of English players or English like speaking players would get included in these teams, and they were just kind of like everything was in French. And it was like the difference, they're like, we're playing for this one nation together, but everyone's speaking French, which you now see as a dynamic within the country, within kind of the conflict that's going on there between the English speaking part and the French speaking part. That's just kind of been manifested in everything.
The English speaking part, which is actually lower Nigeria, but let's not go into that because I don't want to start a civil war. Anyway, so let's get back to this match. 1984 Africa Cup of Nations final. Do we need to discuss how both teams got to the final?
The size of the tournament, obviously, because that's a huge comparison with these days, isn't it? It's an eight team tournament, 2 groups of 4.
Yeah, much smaller than it was today, and I think it's really interesting because you look back at some of the two of the teams that are missing from this one are Malawi and Togo. They're the only two kind of missing. But then the groups were pretty difficult. Like Cameroon's group was pretty tough when you had Egypt and the host Ivory Coast in there, or Cote d'Ivoire. And then poor Togo were just kind of like I don't think I can pronounce that one. And then the other Algeria, Nigeria, and Ghana all in one group. Like if you had that today, you'd be like, that's a group of death instantly. Putting Nigeria and Ghana together as well. Whenever I saw those two teams matched up in a tournament, I was like, it's always going to be good. And just imagine the social media age if it had been happening back then, like those two countries at each other. It's always great fun.
Yeah, when we were watching, doing our homework on this, and one of the clips, or one of the sites which features some of the clips has got one of the Cameroonian players who got one of the goals. He says he got the decisive goal. I think that would be the third one, although arguably it could be the second one. But he says, in past Africa Cup of Nations, we always seem to be meeting Nigeria, and we of course always beat them. I'm like, fuck off. Fuck off. What the fuck is... Anyway, maybe things were different in those days, because when you look through the Nigeria squad compared to the Cameroonians, I think when you watch this match, you'll see, certainly after the first half, they're just a lot fitter than the Nigerians. Nigerians start flagging, and there's one point, I think it might be the goal that Roger Miller assisted, the second goal, I think, where the Nigerian, he dribbles past the Nigerian defender. The Nigerian defender does one of those, he collapses on the floor, kind of like, and he's watching, he's turning around, looking at the ball going to the goal behind him. I'm like, why are you on the floor? because he was knackered. They were all knackered. Is that too harsh to say that the Cameroonians were jammy in that respect, that they were fitter?
Or more prepared? And it was a surprise to me seeing that the Nigerians had a local coach.
Yeah, no, it was kind of the mixture of those kind of two different things. And they had a lot of like domestic players as well. Quite a few like memorable names, the Stephen Keshi and the like, but they had just won it in 1980 as well at home. And I don't know if you've watched that final, but that one they just absolutely blitzed through. I think it was Algeria at the time. They just absolutely smoked them in the first kind of half, just went straight through them, and then they could kind of relax and play their game. But Cameroon were never going to go away in this one. They did just seem that those goals at the end, the third goal as well. It's kind of, I don't know where you can put it down to fitness, but it's one of those kind of desperations. You've got the Keshi long throw that they've just been continuously launching into the box as well, and it finally breaks the other way. And you're right, they're kind of all knackered on the floor. But the second one, poor Emmanuel Akala in goals, just kind of sold completely short by no one tracking the runner at all of a beggar. He just kind of like waltzes through the defense. I mean, the pass from Miller is incredible, but the kind of lack of tracking the man in the 79th, 78th minute is a bit kind of telling, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fascinating game, and full house, 27,000 at the stadium. That was nice to see.
In Abidjan?
For goodness sake, just say like they say it, Tim.
I don't know.
Otherwise, you go to Côte d'Ivoire, you get into a cab and say, I want to go to Abidjan. You'll end up in another country. Abidjan. So in Abidjan, as Tim was saying. Yeah, it was the right, I suspect it was the right country to host the Africa Cup of Nations. As you know, Côte d'Ivoire this time is the right country to host this one, you know, the game-changing one, if this is to be that. What's so special about hosting Africa Cup of Nations, second time round this time, in Côte d'Ivoire?
I think it's just, for me, it's quite nice because, I mean, these last kind of couple of years, it's just been a bit of a nightmare for CAF in terms of finding people to actually host the competition that either are willing to or say they're willing to, then actually can host the competition, because we've had Cameroon have been meant to host like a couple of times. They just keep having to defer it, which means we've then had to go to Egypt a few times. And
this is the dilemma of the size, isn't it? Because once it becomes so big, there are fewer nations that are all right. It's great, inclusive. There are more nations going, but there are fewer nations that can host the thing.
Yeah, which is then more remarkable when Equatorial Guinea kind of step up in 2015, because they had to co-host with Gabon in 2012, and suddenly they're like, well, we'll just get the Chinese in to build a couple of stadiums, so it's fine. Yeah. But you're then talking, well, what's the legacy for Equatorial Guinea in football? Like, these stadiums are never going to be really used or full again. They've had to, like, kind of like the Qatar World Cup, where they've got to kind of like dismantle these things and put them into different purposes and stuff. And I think that's why you can go to somewhere like Côte d'Ivoire, which obviously you're still using a couple of the stadiums that they had in 1984 as well, just kind of been repurposed a little bit, which is nice. But it's such a big country and such a football-loving country that I think I'm so used to as well. Like, when you go to Egypt, like, yes, it's when Egypt are playing, it's incredible. Or when the North African teams are playing, it's incredible because the fans come. But when they're not playing, it's just dead. It's really depressing, and the games just have no life. Whereas I think what we've seen in this tournament is you've seen quite a few of these other West African nations have been able to get their fans there, whether they've been doing crazy travels across different borders and stuff, which has been like hilarious to see kind of the things people are doing to come and watch their teams. But it feels like there's been more of an atmosphere in each of the games, and you get the locals seem to be turning up a lot as well. I think we've seen a lot of Côte d'Ivoire shirts in the crowd. And then you look at this final, obviously Cameroon and Nigeria playing, and they turned up. So it's like, you know, they were going to turn up as long as you kind of make it a little bit more accessible. And there have been some issues with tickets and stuff like that, but the people are coming, and I think that's what makes it such a special one for me. And it just seems
at this point in '84, the tournament has been around for 27 years, and as you're saying, it's a full stadium. Right from the start, was it a success? The African Cup of Nations, was it a success with the public? I imagine that TV is coming in quite slowly across Africa during the 60s. So what are the audiences in the stadium, and what are the audiences around the continent for this tournament?
So it's kind of similar situation sense of like when the hosts are playing, people are there, like people are turning up, and if it's the final, people are also turning up. It doesn't matter if the host nation's there, people will come. And a lot of the times they'd actually put the third place and the final on the same day. Especially when I think there's one where Ethiopia make it into the third place final. So they put it all on the same day when it's in Ethiopia. So the fans just stay because they're like, well, we've come to see our team. We lost, but we may as well stay for the next one as well. So it is actually quite well received, and there's a couple of like FIFA did quite a few reports on like what they saw when they went. They sent their delegations to make sure that Africa was doing the right thing and CAF was like behaving itself or whatnot. And they would always comment that the crowds were good for the finals. It's just those kind of group games and stuff like that where they've tried to kind of spread it around a bit. But because the tournament's quite small at the beginning, they can kind of keep it in the major cities or even just have it in the capital city, and you know you're going to get the people to come and watch it. So crowd-wise at the beginning, it is quite good, but it's not really accessible because obviously there's no TV. There is footage of these early games, but it wasn't really kind of things people were watching all the time. But as you get into the 80s, 70s, and 80s, people are able to access it and they are able to kind of follow it live.
And crucially, remember, just like in many other countries, developing countries, Tim, crucially, you've got radio. So a lot of the Africa Cup of Nations has been accessed by radio and people gathering round radios. And if you see, or if you saw people in Nigeria I was there a year before in '83, but I did hear a lot of commentary on radio, football matches, domestic football matches, and a crowd of people would gather around a bar, and it would be like watching TV. You will not miss the pictures because there is so much interaction and so much emotion around the games as well. Once upon a time, people would have said, Equatorial Guinea, who are they? But not anymore.
How did if the Nigerian commentators speak at the speed that you use when you're doing your Nigerian voice, they'll be miles behind the game. How do they do it?
This is the second time you wound me up about the speed. I'm doing it for our domestic audience. Oh, do you want me to talk like a Nigerian? Very, very fast. No. That would be embarrassing. But at this World Cup, 40 years later, I mean, the great thing about looking back at 1984 now, at the Africa Cup of Nations, which was what, the 17th? It was the 17th, wasn't it? Africa Cup of Nations that we're talking about. And I think when you look back from the benefit of hindsight and looking at it from the point where we've hosting the latest Africa Cup of Nations, you suddenly realize, you asked or you posed the question, what benefit of Equatorial Guinea got from hosting the World Cup? Probably not very much benefit for the poor man on the streets of Equatorial Guinea, where they've got an authoritarian dictator, a great dictator who can decide to sell the country or some of its very valuable resources, primarily oil, to the Chinese for the sake of having the kudos of hosting Africa Cup of Nations. But football is such a beast that if you host a decent world tournament, it has ramifications on the street. Certainly, Africa is still at that stage where kids play football on the street, and everybody would want to be Roger Milla, for a moment. And that is everybody right across the continent, not just people in Cameroon. So I'm not saying that's a justifiable conclusion or dividend, but I would say that Equatorial Guinea being responsible for the greatest upset in Africa Cup of Nations history when they beat Cote d'Ivoire earlier on this week as we speak now, although Cote d'Ivoire managed to wriggle their way into the round of 16, perhaps unjustifiably from...
Are they going to bring the coach back? What are they doing?
No,
he's gone.
Coming back. He ain't coming
He's definitely
back.
gone.
Yeah, he ain't coming back. Did you see the match, Tim? He ain't coming back. You wouldn't have him back, with a barge pole. But, and Chris Hughton's a goner as well. But Ghana going out of the African Cup of Nations is a big, huge deal. You don't realise that when you look at it from our perspective.
I appreciate how massive it is on the continent. Do you think, Ben, if FIFA had let Africa in earlier, do you think that even by this stage, by 84, you would have seen far better, more competitive African teams ready to really get through to the knockout stage of the World Cup?
Yeah, I think if they had opened up the qualification process more. Like if there'd been more qualifying spots, I think, because I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure they were competing with like Asian teams and South American teams for some of their places in the
just
final
with
at some
just
point.
with Asia.
Just with Asia, yeah.
That was part of the problem in '66. There was one place for Asia and Africa combined, and the Africans pulled out anyway because Stanley Rouse wouldn't throw out South Africa. And the justification is standards. Who's the team who qualifies? North Korea. They beat Italy and they go 3-0 up on Portugal. It just blows the standards argument out of the water. But that shouldn't be an argument anyway, because how are they going to get better if you don't let them in the loop?
Exactly. And I think that's one of the benefits that AFCON has seen of kind of growing it. And you can have the arguments, maybe it's too big now, or maybe not. But then you get teams like Mauritania that can qualify, and now they're winning, and now they're really competitive. Or you've got Namibia who've kind of been in and out, and now they're competitive. I think we're still waiting for kind of East Africa to kind of catch up with the rest of them. They are the big, like, I don't think kind of it's one that people notice as much, but when you take a step back and look at it, you're like, wow, yeah, no, East Africa has really little footballing power, but their domestic game in Africa is really strong. Like the Tanzania domestic league.
My brother used to live in Tanzania, and he's been away from it for a fair while now. And he was telling me that if you were to go back to the capital, Dar es Salaam now, he's been away for maybe 20 years, he wouldn't recognize it because it's growing so much. It's grown so much. And a lot of the African cities, they look on course to be the biggest cities in the world within a relatively short space of time. I remember working a few years ago with someone from the BBC from Kenya, and he was saying, most African capital cities, you can run through them in 20 minutes. But that was then, that's not now. And it's certainly not the future. So do you think as these cities grow, then even East Africa can come to the party and Africa can be much, much more competitive on a global basis? Because football is the game of the city.
Yeah, no, I think you're really right. Yeah, like the kind of urban trend that we're seeing in Africa is massive, and like second cities and all these other cities
Because that's how South American football became South American football. The growth of the city. It's absolutely vital to it.
I think what kind of I'm not going to say I'm an expert on Tanzanian football or anything like that, but what I would say that I see, especially in this team that I'm looking at now, is I am quite kind of skeptical of their kind of decision on who they've picked to play in this competition. Like they've picked a lot of players from kind of lower English tier football, when I'm sure there must be some very, very good domestic Tanzanian players that play for the likes of Simba, Young Africans. Like they've got a very, very good league, but they've kind of picked this very kind of strange looking team to me. And Kenya kind of have done it the same recently as well, where I don't know what it is that because they have had these big cities and other countries have had these big cities as well that they're able to tap into. But I don't know what is going on with kind of Tanzania and Kenya. I think they're the kind of the two you look at as kind of the big ones that you think these two, in terms of like the size of the country, the love for the game of football, they should be competitive at AFCON, and they just aren't. Like Tanzania probably have been the least competitive, I think, at this competition compared to the likes of Mauritania. Like you look at Mauritania and you think, well, they've not got massive amounts of kind of footballing history, or kind of they don't have a strong domestic league. They haven't got that with them, but Tanzania do, and they just don't seem to be able to be competitive, or Kenya as well. So I think you're right. I think they'll have now, like as the cities grow, maybe they will kind of be able to like take control of that and do something with that. But then you're relying on kind of the football association to kind of take advantage of it. And do you trust them to do that? You can never really know with kind of some of these African football associations what they're actually there to do. If they're there to make the kind of the national team better and the game better, or if they're just there for their own kind of sake. And I know Nigerian Ghana fans have a lot to say about their football associations, especially Ghana fans at the moment. While they were like, Chris Hughton needs to be sacked, they have kind of flipped their focus on the FA because they're like, you are not stewarding the game in Ghana properly with the talent that we have. So Tanzania and Kenya, they've got everything they need to be good, that to bring East African football to the standard of the West African side. But I just don't know when someone just needs to get their hands on it and who like really knows what they're doing and actually take it to the next level.
I wonder if the other side of this conversation is, first of all, do we need to talk more about the management of football in Africa, the federations, as you pointed out, the facilities that are available. And like you yourself, Tim, have rightly said, sometimes, certainly in 1984, we're talking about pitches not being of the standards that we would be used to over here. Whereas most of the players, as you pointed out, Ben, in this 1984 tournament 40 years ago in the Africa Cup of Nations, were domestic players and probably more used to playing on pitches like that. But we can't argue that it would have been a much more appealing and perhaps dynamic tournament if the pitches were like carpets like we have now. Although in 1984 the pitches weren't quite like carpets here either. But that seems to be part of the African Cup of Nations narrative. And crucially, the real point I want to make is just about how, and you touched on it earlier, how I think we've only just started, maybe in the last African Cup of Nations, if not really in this one, taking it seriously enough for it to benefit financially in the way all the other regional tournaments seem to benefit. I know in South America, you might struggle a little bit, but people are realizing now, or have realized for some time actually, that the South American national tournaments are much, are something worth promoting, something worth investing in. And the Asia Cup as well, going on at the same time as the African Cup of Nations, it does seem to have the sort of financial backing behind it. Africa Cup of Nations just seems to be like a little bit of a Wild West, but the funds that would boost those national sides and make this Africa Cup of Nations something that we'd all be talking about just don't seem to have appeared. They don't seem to have materialized. And if they have, well, like you suggested about the national teams, it's not getting to where it's supposed to get to.
No, I think you could kind of do almost like a bingo card for every AFCON, couldn't you? With like what's happening before in terms of are the stadiums ready, are the pitches ready, has everyone received their bonuses? And I'm talking about players and stuff. Who's refusing to turn up because they haven't received their bonuses? But also we saw it with this tournament, especially. And I think there was a lot more scrutiny of it. Was like, where were people going for their pre-tournament preparation? And that was really interesting to see. Like Equatorial Guinea stayed in Equatorial Guinea because they're like, well, it's the same continent. But loads of people just went off to Dubai, Doha, like to the Middle East to do their kind of pre-tournament prep. And who's been one of the best teams in this tournament? They've been Equatorial Guinea. They're prepared. They've done their preparation for this. Obviously, Cote d'Ivoire have been training at home, but I don't know if they just completely fell apart. And that again, kind of, you're talking about head coach. We're talking a bit about coaching and stuff, and I think coaching needs to be massively highlighted in terms of bringing in substandard European coaches rather than you looking within your country to the actually very well qualified African coaches that you already have. Senegal, obviously, at the moment are famous for what they've got there. A couple of other like nations have actually done it. Like Nigeria, obviously, did it with Stephen Keshi, and have been quite like famous for doing it. But then every now and then they'll go get the guy like who they've got now. Like it's all just a bit strange in terms of kind of like the round robin of coaches that go around. Like Claude Leroy just seems to be there all the time, just constantly getting like shafted into different sort of jobs. So I think the coaching needs to be a big focus, and that's something the football associations could really take seriously and kind of push through, because player wise, then like the players don't really stay long enough in the domestic leagues to be kind of under their tutelage. They go and they'll go to Europe and they'll develop over there, and that's just the way it is. It's another kind of train of resources from Africa to Europe. It's just now it's with football players. But in terms of coaching, they could do so much better, I think, in raising up these like African coaches. To then we finally get an African coach breaking into kind of like the European circuit at like the Premier League level, like Serie A, all these other kind of like these top leagues, because you can't tell me there aren't guys out there who are more than qualified to do the job,
There
who'd
are.
be absolutely brilliant, but they just don't get the opportunities.
You're absolutely 100% right. But I think that conversation has started as a result of this particular Africa Cup of Nations. I mean, we always wondered
Well,
about
maybe with
this.
Senegal. I think Senegal put
I
this
think
one
with
in.
Ghana as well. Ghana is. I don't think they're going to have a European coach next time around. I don't think the Ghanaian fans will allow it, and they're probably, in my experience, the second most passionate in sub-Saharan Africa. Let me quickly qualify. Well, look, everybody's got passionate fans, but I just saw something in the 2010 World Cup when I was based in Accra for that World Cup. I just saw something about their fans that I hadn't seen elsewhere. Not only are they passionate, they're very organised as well.
Well,
You know,
it's because they're
proper
fortified by the
ultras.
best jollof rice in the world.
No, they're not. No, they're not. Unfortunately for them, it's Nigeria that's fortified by that. But thank you for throwing that in just to wind me up. I went all over Accra looking for jollof rice that was better. I did, genuinely. I'm not joking. I asked my colleagues. I said, no, I've got to find it must be better than this. It must get better. But it never did. I'm just saying that. But I think it is. I mean, this is what we're so good at on the world, let me say that again.
They're interchangeable. They're interchangeable.
Yes, somewhat. Well, they feature both you and I. So, but this is what's so wonderful about the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast is because
and the World Football Phone-In.
And it allows us, and F-Freeze as well, which is
that's right. Yeah, available from all fine booksellers.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ben. We're talking about your book, but I knew what was coming next. Tim was going to ask me why I called my book by a title that rhymes with Jeffries. F-Freeze. Although we're talking about the Africa Cup of Nations, the history of an underappreciated tournament by Ben Jackson, but it gives us the opportunity, this podcast, to sort of see what the ramifications of all these conversations are, because here we have an Africa Cup of Nations now in 2024 that even before it's over, in the midst of it, it has inspired this sort of philosophical soul searching about where Africa is as a continent of football. Everybody wants to win the Africa Cup of Nations now, any joke business, but it's the conversation, the philosophical conversation is with the people rather than, with the federations, which I think is a really fascinating moment. That's the game ended 3-1, as you've said. The Nigerian coach, and he was a Nigerian, says it was a fix. Any truth in that from a neutral point of view? Or do you want me to answer it?
I'm gonna not say anything. I don't think it was a fix, but you just don't know, do you? I guess. I'll let you give your side, and
crucially, the Nigerian coach isn't blaming the Côte d'Ivoire for the fix. He's not blaming the match officials for the fix. He's blaming Nigerians in power who, whether it was part of a betting scandal or whatever, didn't want to see Nigeria win. So he's basically saying they nobbled some of their players, their own players.
I mean, they're not afraid to kind of get involved, are they? Like, I think if you're looking kind of throughout history of Nigerian football and the powers that be, especially I kind of like fast forwarding a little bit to the 90s where they basically denied one of the best Nigerian teams ever the chance of winning a couple more AFCONs because of what they did with the human rights guys and the assassinations and stuff like that, and the kind of the fallout from that. So you wouldn't put it past them.
Ken Saro-Wiwa, you're talking about him.
Yeah, really horrific kind of decision that the government took to kind of just assassinate these guys and then to double down on it when Mandela basically called them out and say we're not going to 1986.
He and I think 11 of the Igoni people were hanged. They were hanged, found guilty by a despotic leader of Nigeria, Sani Abacha, who, was responsible for many people's deaths. I mean, technically speaking, I can see why you call it an assassination, but I don't want people to think, this is Dallas 1963 or anything like that. It wasn't that. It was more kind of state assassination, wasn't it? Nigeria's been shocking in that respect, but if the Nigerian coach's theory is correct, then it would have been 3-1 to Nigeria. Everybody knows that. Why are you laughing, Tim? Why are you laughing? Is that not conceivable?
Declare an interest.
Well, now that you forced me to declare an interest, I think we'll move swiftly on. What about the charts? If we look at the pop charts, as we always do, Ben, to sort of give us a musical context of the time. So we're talking about the Africa Cup of Nations final, March 1984. Guess what was in the charts at the time?
How old were you at this time, Ben?
Yeah, minus something.
Yeah, that's why I said guess. That's why I said guess what was in the charts.
God.
I think was it Lionel Richie was in there? I saw Lionel Richie was in there. I was like, I know him.
Yeah. He's at number one, by the way, with Hello.
Nice.
Is it me you're looking for? Yeah, he's at number one. I can actually sing every single one of the songs in the top 10. I know you don't want me to.
No,
but
it is. We were kicking every ball, weren't we? Because I was 18, coming on 19, and it was an interesting time. This Ben, after being schooled by you for so long, we can reverse the polarity.
Yes.
What there was at this point was a really strong anti-rock vibe. Really, really strong. And rock was the thing that I saw Suggs give an interview on this a while back. No one listened to it. No one was at all interested. And what was coming through was there was a lot of jazz, like kind of pop jazz. When Carmel, for example, there's a kind of English version of Etta James. Matt Bianco, kind of light jazz pop. And that whole thing was, and Live Aid the following year is an absolute game changer and entirely for the worse. For me, it's a disastrous cultural event for all that you could argue about its political benefits, although the people who behind it, I think, were utterly sincere in what they were trying to do. But in cultural terms, it just brought back Stadium Rock. And at this point, Stadium Rock, because I know Queen are in there with Radio Gaga, but no one was really interested. And there was a really anti-rock vibe going on here. This, I'm sorry, you can go and make a tea or something like that because I'm going to bore you now. But this week, it's one of the most important weeks in my life. I'm amazed.
I agree. I agree, actually. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why specifically for me, because we were talking the other time, Dotun, about the importance of like going to university and how that was a dividing line between so many people of our generation, and you, because your dad was an academic, despite all of your setting fire to the school for crying out loud, you delinquents.
I don't know why I did it. It seemed like a good idea at the time,
Yes. So you were always going to go there. That was going to be your path. For me, it wasn't. My folks left school at 15, 16. And I went to a school. It was an ex-secondary modern. I don't think it ever got anyone to university ever. So it was never mentioned. And then that school got closed down. So sixth form, I went to another school that had been an ex-grammar school. And there was much more, it was more middle class. And I remember this meeting of the sixth form. And they were using all this vocabulary that's specific to universities, like UCA forms and campus university. And I didn't have a clue what was going on. I just didn't know this vocabulary. So right there and then I said, well, bugger this. This isn't for me. I'm not going to do it. I just took I don't understand. I'm lost. I don't understand what's going on. So I left school in 83. I was going to get a job in a local paper, and the local paper went bust. Long hot summer of 83, there's just no jobs. There's nothing around. I've got all these O-levels and A-levels. There's nothing around. I get a job in a menswear shop. And my second week there, it goes into liquidation. So, I worked there for a fair few months because it was a chain, and it was the last one of the chain to stay open. But it was just a long closing down sale. So I'm thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do now? I know. I've got all the bits of paper. I'll go to university. So I sorted it out. And the only reason was I was going to avoid the labour market for 3 years. And it's this month that I sorted out my interview. I thought, history and politics, that sounds good. Warwick, now that's Coventry. I can just get there on the train from Hemel. So I'm So that's what I'm going to do. So, I went up, got an interview, went up there. Went to the place for the interview, and for a kind of humanities lecturer, I'm just his dream. This mouthy, semi-house trained council estate kid in a quite magnificent leather trench coat. He just loved me, and he said, I'm not allowed to say this really, but you're in. So I thought, yeah, that's great. Brilliant. All right. Left the place, went back into Coventry, bought the 12-inch. It came out that very day, My Ever-Changing Moods by the Style Council, which is my band. And I saw them for the first time. It was their first UK tour then. It's my band. I went home, and I still didn't know what university was. I still had no idea. And it was during the summer when the student union sent a pack of oh yeah, there's a student union building. There's all these bars and these things. This is going to be all right, isn't it? Yeah. But that was the first time. I had no idea. It's so different from You know, parents of today who go around looking at universities and they say, "Oh yeah, where's the laundry done?" And I didn't know what it was until I turned up. So, and this is the week when it all happened for me. It's the week, I'm sorting out going to university. It's the week that I'm seeing the Style Council for the first time on the first tour. And if you hadn't read Absolute Beginners, you didn't get it. But if you had read Absolute Beginners, you did. Because Absolute Beginners, it's the very start of the mod movement in '58. The very start. Before it's all lumpens fighting on Brighton Beach, it's modern jazz and Italian style and an English swagger, and you put it all together. So all the little pieces in my jigsaw are falling while, and this is an entire coincidence, while Cameroon are winning the Africa Cup of Nations, I am making a kind of journey of adolescent to young adult. So just thinking about this week has just blown my mind. It's taken me on a journey. Dotun does this from time to time, Ben. He'll launch into a story. Usually there's a woman involved. There aren't any women involved in my little anecdotes, but that's what I've got for you.
Mate, look, it's a very similar trajectory, though, because remember, about this time, I wouldn't say this particular week, because I think it's a bit too early for me to sort of start getting into it, but I'm about to go to university. Even though there's a 6-year age difference between you and I.
So you've come back from Sweden after perhaps murdering someone.
You're going to have to read all about it in Effries. Yes, indeed. Well, I can safely say...
I hope it kept you up at night.
Let me just get to the point I was going to make, which is 1984. As I was looking at these charts, I was thinking, why do I know all these songs so well? How comes I can still sing all these songs so well? And I thought, oh, yeah, 1984. Just came back from doing a degree in Sweden, which I didn't finish because my mother died.
Murdering passers-by.
No, because my mother died at the time, in the middle of all of this. And... she died a little bit before, actually. But anyway, I used that excuse not to finish the degree in Sweden, and I came back and I had to sort of do something here, and I didn't have a complete degree from Sweden, so I had to sort of start again, as it were, and start applying for universities. I just wanted to just do it and get it done.
Your dad was so proud of you, wasn't he?
No, he wasn't at this point. And hold on, wait a second. At this point, he wasn't. And so I came back to the UK, and there must have been a few months before I went to university. So this is why it's around this time, where I literally was twiddling my thumbs with nothing else to do.
With the radio on.
Yeah, with the radio on, following the charts, watching Top of the Pops, getting into the new scene. For example, you see Your Love is King at number 9 by Sade. When you were talking about the jazz, you missed her out, and that was a really important moment.
It was
British jazz. She had been nominated Artist of the Year. I think it was an NME, and then they did NME. I'm pretty sure it was NME. It could have been Sounds or Melody Maker, but I'm pretty sure it was NME. Used to do a yearly sort of like party for all their nominations for best artists and all of this. Yeah, and it was at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, in the middle of London, just down the road from Buckingham Palace, as you know. Yeah, and she was there, and I remember it so well. I remember her oozing this sort of elegance, and then when it came to the saxophone break, she was wearing this big, very elegant black gown, as it were, a figure-hugging gown, and then when it came to the saxophone break, she turned around, and you realised
it's backless.
Hang on, is that her bum? Is that her bum? I can see just about. If I was a few inches tall, I could see all of it. But so you don't forget a moment like that. So when I started to figure out why I remember this chart so much, that's one of the things that came up. The other thing that came up, Robert De Niro's Waiting, Bananarama, they're all over the place at this time. There were posters everywhere for this Robert De Niro's Waiting. You couldn't wait to hear the flipping song. At number 5, It's Raining Men, the Weather Girls. At the time, of course, we were just all singing it. I didn't realise it was a gay anthem.
You're joking.
No, of course not. I'm not thinking, it's raining men, hallelujah, it's raining men. Look, you're looking gobsmacked.
Yeah,
Tim,
Dotun, can I let you into a secret?
Good.
Liberace was gay.
He's gay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know.
I know it's gonna come as a blow.
It only came out definitively on the day that he died. The Daily Mail couldn't wait, or was it the Daily Express? Couldn't wait to confirm that after he had sued them previously. But this is the point where we don't actually care. I mean, well, most
Indeed.
of us have
Indeed.
moved on from
Exactly.
the position of our
Exactly.
parents where it was a big deal. So I didn't think of that. Number three, really interesting. Break Machine were a little hip hop
Well, look
duo.
at African Bambata.
I would stay away from talking about him.
Ben, this is a serious change. Hip hop culture is coming in, and the English are already taking a piss out of it. Hello,
They
John,
are-
got a new motor.
I was
Hello,
about to
John,
say
got a new
that.
motor.
I was just about to say we think too much
He
alike.
can't
I was
half
just
play
about-
the bongos. He can't half play the bongos.
It was a mad record by a comedian called Alexis Sale, who was
What's
an
that switch
alternative
over there
stand-up.
for?
Yeah.
Ow, 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 ow. It's fucking brilliant. Go and listen to Hello, John, got a new motor.
Don't forget his
Spouse are taking a piss out of Cockneys. It's brilliant.
You got to see the video as well. He's wearing a trilby and a very, very
He's an
tight
Avon representative.
Okay. And you got Frankie Goes to Hollywood. They were number
Yes.
one. Remember, they'd got
Relax.
to number one. Relax, and it had been banned by the BBC.
Don't do
Somebody's Watching Me, Rockwell, one of the great sing-along tunes as well in this charts. I mean, if you go through the charts, you just see
Culture Club, It's a Miracle, Would
Oh, my
Be,
goodness.
Scritti Politti, all
Yeah.
this kind of anti-rock stuff, a lot of bass synth around. But
Let
that
the music
anti-rock
play.
vibe, yeah, Shannon.
That was
that's
a huge
record,
tune, man. And I think
Huge.
that might have only been available on 12-inch dance record. I'm not too sure about UB40s. That was at number 27, UB40 28 with
That was
their
dreadful,
cover of
wasn't it?
Cherry O Baby.
No,
Well,
it
you need
didn't
to
work.
listen to the original. The original is actually very interesting because the guy that did it, Eric Donaldson, was it Eric Donaldson? I'm pretty sure it was Eric Donaldson. He was like a proper country boy in Jamaica when reggae was like an urban experience. No, there were two types of reggae, to be fair. There was the rural or the semi-rural experience, and then there was the urban experience. But no, I'm not sure it is Eric Donaldson. I can't remember what his name is. The original guy that did Cherry O Baby. But what he came from the countryside. Jamaica used to have an annual kind of sing-a-thon, a kind of an annual. I suppose the only way I can describe it is an annual. What do you call it? A Eurovision kind of thing. Yeah, and he showed up with wearing his country dungarees. Eric Donaldson, it is Eric Donaldson. He showed up wearing his country dungarees and started singing this song, and people laughed their heads off. And then they started dancing, and they realized, shit, this is the best thing. And he won the Jamaican equivalent of Eurovision, One Nation Eurovision. He won it about 3 times with that song and other songs. But that's how he became a star. UB40 just take the joy and the love out of it, and
they're entering into because I think they were great for the first few years. I think they were fabulous. I know we'll probably disagree on this, but I think they were really, really good. And it was great to see this multiracial band as well.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't got a problem with UB40. I went on tour with them at one time in Scandinavia, and I remember my biggest memory from that tour was that we were in Helsinki, and they're in a hotel, and these two Finnish guys started fighting. And what UB40 didn't understand was the subtlety, because I could understand the language. There was a Finlander and a Finland Swede. There's about 200,000 Finland Swedes who were in the old days of Finland was a colony of Sweden. Sweden was a big colonial power. In fact, Russia was a colony of Sweden, believe it or not. If you go to Stockholm, you'll see a statue of the King Carl XII, and he's pointing east to say, look, as far as you can go east, that's ours, And but yeah, in this Finland Swede was fighting this Finn at the hotel. I remember on the stairs, they had these kind of like wide sort of palatial stairs, and they were rolling up and down the stairs. And then the Finland Swede says to the Finlander, go to in Finnish, but with a heavy Swedish accent, or vice versa. In Swedish, but with a heavy Finnish accent, I think. Yeah, go to hell, you Finnish bastard. And then I realized, shit, that is deep, man. Because they're both Finnish, but they distinguish between all the road signs in Helsinki, in Finland. I don't know if in all of Finland, certainly in Helsinki, they're in two languages. All the road signs are in Swedish and in Finnish. And you know, if a policeman arrests you, this was the case 40 years ago, 1984. If a policeman arrested you and you were a Finland Swede, he had to arrest you in Swedish. Otherwise, it was invalid. Can you believe that? Anyway, so they had a lot of power over their weight, and that's my anecdote from UB40. I haven't got a problem with it. My missus did a gig last year with Ali Campbell at Warwick Park, at Warwick Castle, and I got to meet him properly out of being a journalist, etc. Anyway, other tunes, Special, aka Free Nelson Mandela.
All routes lead to Africa.
Of course,
Ben,
at some point or other. But
what's your connection? What's your connection to the continent? Do you have a favourite country there?
It is that trip to Sierra Leone when I was a kid. That's kind of like the one. I've been to a couple of other countries since, but like Sierra Leone's kind of the special one for me. Just because it changed my perception of the continent completely. Like I'd gone in with this kind of mindset of everything that we saw on TV, like all the adverts and kind of like the poverty images and stuff. And yes, Sierra Leone's very poor, but like there was just something else that I was like, no, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. This is very different to everything I've ever kind of imagined. It just completely changed my mind on the continent. And then going to other countries and kind of comparing them to Sierra Leone and the different like the kind of that kind of idea that Africa's a continent, not a country, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Like that's always been something that kind of I've noticed every time I've been. So yeah, it's kind of since I was a teenager, it's kind of just been fascinating me, especially like the history of the continent as well. I just find it amazing.
Do you not find, Tim, though, and I think you expressed that really eloquently, Ben, do you not find, though, Tim, in South America, it's an amazing place? And do you not sit thinking at some point or other, people are going to discover how wonderful this place is and that the people have such a richness that reminds us.
I'm worried for the place. Really, really worried. Yeah, because and this perhaps would be a good place to end, comparing this with Africa, because I can't see how the big cities are becoming less and less viable in South America, just because I can't see how a modern economy is going to include the people in the urban people. Can't see what's going to happen to them. Massive process of deindustrialization, and people are now starting to think about industrial strategies and so on. But the cities are just getting more and more violent, and I find this a real cause for concern. And it's something you really notice when you leave it. As the African cities, as you get more and more African children living in a concrete situation, do you think Africa will be able to avoid some of these problems?
Ben?
It's just so dependent on the governance, isn't it? It's so dependent on how the state responds to it. And I think some states will probably have some decent strategies to deal with with that, but there's so many that are struggling now, and it's that kind of thing that a lot of them are lucky, well, not lucky, but they can kind of just be like, well, we'll just leave that to the aid agencies and the NGOs and they can deal with those people because we don't actually have to, because we know that they're going to come in and they're just going to feed them, house them, and do all of that, and we just don't have to really worry about it. So I'm quite skeptical as to how they're going to deal with kind of this massive urban influx of people, because they haven't dealt with it, and it's like some of them do not have the capacity to deal with it, and it's not even their fault. Like the states they do not have the funding or anything like that to be able to like manage these cities. But then a lot of them, even if they did, because they can just kind of fall back on the NGOs, the agencies, like foreign aid and stuff, they can kind of almost like palm it off a little bit to them and just focus on doing what they actually want to do, which for some of them has just been to make sure they remain in power at all costs.
Yeah, it's a nightmare sometimes. I think that's a good point to end this conversation. I'm reluctant to leave it without saying, all we are asking is let Nigeria win this year's Africa Cup of Nations. Well, why not? We've been talking
1984 Aswad live and direct. Special request to the Sierra Leone posse.
Yes, indeed. I was there at that gig, by the way. I was there at that gig. Anyway, thank you very much. It's been a real fascinating conversation.
And there are
what's the
so
ne-
many more to be had on the African football and the AFCON. We're going to have to do this again.
Oh, yeah, anytime you like. Just remind me the title of the book, Ben.
Yeah, so Africa Cup of Nations, history of an underappreciated tournament.
Underappreciated, but not for much longer, mate. Not for
Not after
much
this
longer.
one.
Yeah, no, well, I'd like to see them underappreciated next time around. It's been absolutely fabulous. Thank you for telling us all about the game in 90 or the final in 1984. And let's speak again.